Hi everyone, welcome to From Demo to Master, our Waves 4-part mixing course. I want to thank everybody for registering and showing interest and support. And before we get started, I also want to thank the team that's behind the scenes at Waves.com and all the hard work they did helping me shape the content and doing the editing and bringing you this live's webinar. There's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes, so I just want to give a big shout out to them before we get started. So I hope you enjoyed the first episode and got a little orientation about how we're going to be presenting our ideas through the course. And we're here today to take some questions on things that might have come up for you while you were watching. And remember, you can, if a question occurs to you now while you're watching, you can type it into the comments box down below at the bottom of the website. So I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, Gitai, who's here with me behind the camera.
Hello, hello, hello.
And he's going to be fielding questions online from you guys and picking ones that he thinks are appropriate. And hopefully we can shed a little bit more light on episode 1.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for having us in your very, very cool studio. Let's start. Let's jump right in and start with the first.
I got my tennis racket ready.
All right. So
serve.
The first question is from Martin,
Okay.
and he asks, in the first episode of the course, you briefly mentioned how you choose different tracks for foreground and for background. How do you decide which of the source tracks will come into focus and which will be minor or even dropped?
Okay, that's a kind of a musical question. So as we're mixing, we're technicians, and as we're producers, we're musicians. So in any good arrangement, there's things that are more important to the flow of the record and the impact of the record and things that are less so, depending on the genre. So of course, one of the reasons I started with bass and drums is because that's the foundation. And a lot of times people like songs, and songs become hits because of that first groove. Think of Satisfaction or C&C Music Factory, Everybody Dance. That first 4 bars of impact is what really grabs you. So those are the elements that you really have to identify and focus on. Secondly, your lead, which is going to be what we talk about in episode 2, your lead singer, whether it's a lead horn line, a lead guitar line, whatever it is. So as I'm setting up, and when I was talking about the color coding and everything, as I'm setting up, I'm learning what the parts are, and I'm making sort of mental notes to myself of, okay, this is the foundation of the beat, maybe the kick and snare kinds of things, and then these little percussion parts are maybe secondary parts of the beat. Then we go to the bass and the keyboards. In fact, here I have Better World up right now, which was one of the songs we worked on. And if you look here where my cursor is, you see in the keyboard part here at a certain section, there's 4 parts playing at the same time. So I would listen to those parts together maybe and say, okay, which ones are really the important ones and which ones are playing support roles. And a lot of times I ask the producer to render those together as one stereo track because he's making that decision before me. But just as a quick example, let's go to that and hear what that's going to be. That's these 4 pads here. Okay, so we have the piano does the whole note, so that's marking the chord changes with a little transient move right there. And then we have a little portamento melody line. Next, let me get a little closer. Oops, sorry. Okay, a sawtooth white noise wave. That's kind of the bottom end of it. Another type of piano. So these 2 pianos would go together. So talking about primary and secondary, if you wanted to be warm, you would push that lower one up. If you wanted it to be sharp, you'd push this one up, which is how I have it. Add the buzzy low end. So you can see the more or less I feature primary or secondary parts, it changes the color. So as we listen to the mix, you'll see me in the chorus touching faders all the time because I'm constantly rethinking that kind of thing. Maybe this shouldn't be quite so forward. Maybe this should be more forward. And that's kind of a cooking analogy, making the soup. Maybe we need a little more of this or that. And finally, when we add the lead. So that's the process, and the short answer is, you use your musician ears and your arranger ears. At that point, you're wearing the producer's hat. Okay?
All right, thank you. So the first episode was about the bass and drums.
Yep.
So let's move into mixing the bass.
Okay.
Cody asks, how do you know how to choose different plugins for different purposes? For example, for making the bass thicker, what would you reach out for? Which plugin?
Okay, so that's a kind of a many-faceted consideration. So if it's just tone to me implies EQ. So if your bass is a little thin, you would open up an EQ, a trusted EQ that you can operate well, and that's why I like the F6 with the RTA, because I can see the readout. Or the HEQ also has the RTA. I like to, not that I'm depending on it, but I like to see the results of what I'm doing. So I might boost some lows, suck out some mids, and maybe eliminate some noisy stuff at the high end. So the first line of attack on fattening up a bass would be EQ. Secondly would be compression, and different styles of compression, if it's very aggressive, can make it very hard sounding. And there's also other psychoacoustic things you can do, like R-bass, which is going to add a little bit of extra frequency at wherever you set the frequency to. And even something like low air, if it's a kind of a trap song or something like that. Low air, the film thing that makes the volcano erupt and the dinosaur feet stomp, can actually accent your 808 bass line in just the right way. So there's quite a few ways to attack it. And I think on this song I used Andrew Shep's omnichannel to get a little saturation, harmonic saturation. That's also another good way to fatten things up.
Well, next question we have is from Andrew. And Andrew asks, what do you think about using a parallel compression on a bass? In what cases this may be useful? And should I send a little bit of the bass sound to the parallel bus of the drums?
Interesting. I don't do that myself, although I don't necessarily dismiss that as a bad idea. What I might do is have the bass have its own parallel compressor, so that I could control the parameters maybe a little differently, because the bass is not going to have those same striking transients. What you get from the parallel compression in drums, the direct drum mics, the kick and snare and toms, is you get a big smack from the transient. The opposite of that is if you compress the room, which is going to give you the longer decays and stuff. So there's those two elements that I like to balance: a really squashed room, which gives you the and the length of drums, and then the parallel compressor, which gives you the smacky transients. Now on a bass, if bass guitar, for example, unless it's played with a pick, there's not quite so many transients because it's played with the pads of the fingers. If it's a synth, of course, you can control the ADSR to get your transients. So if it's a long, sustainy bass part, I can see that as a parallel compression would be able to help bring out the notes, for example, in the bass. But that's not necessarily something that I do. But as I say, it's not a bad idea. And that would be worth a try if you find yourself having trouble hearing the articulation of the bass.
Next one is from Ovidio. And he asks, what is your approach to mixing bass guitar? If you have only one DI track on a bass, any plugin that can help?
I think I did that in the episode on the rock tune. Should I open up another session? Give me a second, and while this is opening, I'll explain what I'm doing. I think that was in Divided, wasn't it?
Probably so.
The first thing I do with a DI, sometimes in certain kinds of music, the DI is actually the best thing because it's super clean, right? There's no extra harmonic information, but it can also be a little thin and trebly, depends on how the guy set his pickups and what kind of a player he is. If you read the books about, like, let's say the Wrecking Crew with Carol Kay, like her whole thing was playing every note perfectly the same. Now that's a real trained, serious studio musician who laid down those kind of tracks every day. But maybe you're just recording your buddy in the garage. That's fine. But the technique is the first point of attack. Getting the really good clean sound in the first place. So secondly, what I did on this rock tune is I doubled the DI track, an exact double, and I inserted I think I did it here. Yep, right here. So here's the bass. Let's get someplace where it's playing good. I'll solo it for a minute. Super DI, right? Nice and clean, well played. And then I put on guitar amp here. And the reason I fell in love with guitar amp in the first place was the Motown presets. Where are they? So down here at the bottom of the list, you see these are all basses. You think of guitar amp for guitars, but this is great for basses. And they have a whole series of Motown, which you remember Motown was the first record label that really had the prominent bass. In fact, the Beatles on Rain were saying, the reason we have the bass so loud is we were trying to get that Motown sound. And James Jamerson was the standard bearer, the famous bass player from Motown that made up all those lines on Marvin Gaye's records and stuff. I kind of like the Motown default, which is really emulating, reamping it through an old flip-top Ampeg, a 15-inch speaker, and just getting a warm, ampy sound. Let's hear that. So you hear the difference between that and direct amp. And then like any two fader sound, you just blend them. And of course make that work with your drums. So when I push up the amp, it gets fatter. And then when I push up the DI, it's cleaner. Now, in solo, that's one thing, but of course this is going to work with all the guitars and the keyboards that are going to be added in later. And so you work in solo for just a minute. Don't work in solo all the time. It may sound great in solo and may not work with all the power guitars. So you have to keep all those balls in play all the time. Okay, now we have a nice fat bass sound. Let's make sure it's not too fat. So that's a taste thing. But that's the way to fatten up the bass. That's called reamping. Now, another way to do that in analog would be to send that signal out of your DAW through your interface to an amplifier and then mic the amplifier. But that's what the amp simulator is doing for you. And it's easy to recall and it's easy to tweak. You don't have to commit to it by recording it.
That makes sense. Perfectly.
I would hope so.
Yeah.
Good. Thank goodness for that.
Good answer. So we're getting quite a few questions about getting the right levels for bass and drums and using meters to do that.
Okay.
For example, let me read here. We have Paul.
Hey, Paul.
And Paul asks, any tips on using the Waves WLM loudness meter to normalize the bass and drums and create a very unified rhythm section? And we actually had similar questions from Cody and Daniel.
That's kind of one of the hardest things about mixing is determining the right amount of bass to kick drum and stuff. A long time ago in the analog world, I heard, I don't know if it's even an apocryphal bit of advice, but they were saying that in the old days, in the 60s and 70s in the rock and pop world, with VU meters, you would get the kick drum hitting -3, and then you would add bass into the mix until the VU meters went to 0. So the extra sonority of the bass moved the VUs from a steady -3 to a steady 0. And in analog mixing, I did that often as a starting point. But it's also a lot about your monitoring system. I don't know that I would use the WLM for that. I would use Waves VU for that, the VU meter plugin. Mm-hmm. but also you have to make sure you're monitoring the right amount of bass. There's monitors that are sold in the music stores that have a little bit of a hyped up bass. And then there's monitors that don't have enough bass. In my studio, I have a sub which is calibrated to the level of my mains, and it's taking everything from, maybe 75 or 60 down and taking that weight off of my monitors. So that way, I'm not trying to make the studio sound like I'm in the Jeep. I just make it sound nice. And then when it goes out to the car, into the Jeep, I'm getting the right amount of bass. So A, try using the VU meters, and then B, make sure your room is calibrated so you're not adding bass that's not necessary, or maybe your room is too boomy and you're taking out bass that needs to be there. So it's very important that you calibrate your room.
So to expand on this subject, we have Daniel, and he's asking if you can tell a few more words about balancing the levels of mixing drums and basses as a preparation for other elements and living headroom. You say you always need to check that main bus does not clip.
Right.
But do you have any set standards about more or less which levels to keep the kick, the snare, bass, etc.?
That's another musical question. There's not a what's the word I'm searching for? There's not a quantifiable calibration for that. I mean, you can quantify the RMS level of records that you're competing with so that your record sounds the same if it's rock or if it's pop or if it's hip hop. But you can't really say, okay, push the kick drum up to -11 and then push the bass into -10 and all that. It's really a musical thing. And I often find I work on the bass and drums first, as I said in the layout of the course. But as I also said, I'm constantly refining. And sometimes I get notes back from the producers. I send the mix off to the record company, and they say, sounds good, Dave, but we need that kick, a little more of that kick, or we don't really hear the bass articulations. It's not an infallible science, and it's more about your taste and your experience. So once again, you put the bass and drums in. So I've already moved the bass around today since we did the episode, and I'm listening in some kind of broadcasty headphones here that's not really telling me a lot of information, but I do hear the attack of the kick. I want to hear the attack of the kick through the whole melee of keyboards and choirs and power guitars, but I also want to hear the notes that the bass player is playing. One thing I always tell my clients when they ask me what I think about the levels is, can I transcribe the part? And transcription means, could I listen to that bass part and write it down? Could I listen to that drum part and write it down? Sure, it's very clear. And the second consideration is it moving me? Is it making me feel any kind of feeling? Is it, in this case, this is a head nodder, a power rock song. So is that making me feel that? And if not, then maybe my levels are not quite right. But don't forget, tone and level are totally intertwined. If you since I just changed the bass amp balance, that's going to change the level. So everything you do, you can't be, here's I'm contradicting myself. I say I'm busy and I'm always touching things. You got to watch out. You can't be too busy because you'll pull the thread and all the things that you've carefully constructed will change. So my tweaks are very, very small. I never just really go, pull that way down. I'm just touching a little bit and going, shade more of the amp, shade more of the hard part of the kick drum sound, not the boomy part. And it's cooking. It's a taste test. You just keep using your ears and experience. There's no way to substitute for experience. I remember when I was first starting out, guys would identify this. There's too much 240. And I'm like, wow, how in the world can you know what 240 is? Now I know what 240 is now after doing it for many, many years. But these are all skills that you just teach yourself, just like practicing an instrument. and you also listen to other people's work. I learn a lot from listening to other guys' mixes, guys who I think are really killing it, and trying to examine like what are they doing that's so good in all different genres, whether it's pop or rock or acoustic music. There's so many good practitioners out there, and you just keep borrowing from everybody and putting it in your bag of tricks.
Well, amazing. So, Dave,
Yes, sir.
We have another question from Alejandro.
Okay.
And he asks, what is your favorite compressor for the drum bus? And how much compression is too much compression? That's a question that a lot of people are asking.
Yeah.
And can you show us what's too much compression
Yeah.
and how to avoid it?
Sure. On my on this particular song, I'm not actually squashing the drum bus, but we were squashing the room. If you remember in the episode, we had a shootout, and I settled on the pie. But you know what? Let's put just an R comp on the drums and show what's like too much is. What happens, and this is also, you can have an argument. This is kind of like religion. Some people like a ton of compression, and that's their thing, and other people don't like any compression. So, what happens to me in the sounds is they start to shrink. So compression gives you attack, but it also evens out the differences in the levels. So let's hear the drums in solo. Okay, so now hear especially what happened to the kick right there. We hear the tap of the beater on the kick, but we don't hear any of the bloom of the. So that's to me is way over compressed. But a little compression on the overall drum bus is not a bad thing at all. In fact, it's a very good technique. But like with all compression, I watch the meter to tell me what's going on. All these compressors, the CLA2A and all that stuff has meters to tell you how much compression you're doing, and that's like a speedometer. It's telling if you're going too fast, it's going to be moving too much. Watch. So they start to spit. Now, in the middle of a mix, that's going to sound small. So you don't even hardly hear the drums anymore. And that takes us back to the parallel guy, because if you bring him up louder, you get that spit. Where is he? I forgot where I put him. Right here. Let me mute the drums and let's just hear the comp. So that's the sound of the parallel compressor, right? That's in addition to the drum bus itself. So that's giving the same sound that we just achieved by overly compressing the entire drum bus. But now I have an open sound on the drum bus to mix with the parallel compressor. So here's the drum bus. And then hear the transient on the kick, pat. And then together. So bringing the parallel compressor up more articulates the sound without adding too much volume. And this is also a good trick. I think I'll talk about it in episode 2 where we're dealing with the lead vocal. In my experience, the two main things that I use parallel on are the drums to make them articulate, and the vocal, if the vocal's not being heard, if it's having trouble being heard, but the level is sounding right, sometimes a parallel comp on the voice works in the same way. It gives it like a little mid bite, a little really squashed sound, which by itself is small, but in the midst of an open, mixed in with an open sound, creates a more articulate sound.
So it's safe to say that the SSL Master Bus compressor is your favorite for the drums?
You know, I'm just very familiar. I owned SSLs in my lifetime, so that was on every mix, and I know the ballistics of that thing, and I really like the Waves emulation of it. It sounds just like the real one to me. I know a lot of people like the API 2500 for that. That's a very popular. It's a very popular compressor, and it's got a very characteristic sound. But an 1176, the CLA 1176, is going to do a nice job of that. The Pi will do a nice job of that too. So anything with an aggressive quality to it. And the SSL is only aggressive because of the way I have it set now. When I would put it on my master bus, I wouldn't be nearly this aggressive, but I want that for the drums. So
great. So if we're talking about tricks, we have Chris, and Chris wants to know, can you share a trick you use to keep the drums powerful and dynamic during courses? Because during courses, usually we have a lot of other elements that are being added,
right,
which take over the space and
right,
might get the drums a bit left out.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you can do is do rides, and just a global group ride, and come up half a dB. I think on some of these songs I showed this is going to be in the automation section of episode 4. Tricks you would do with the automation to enhance, which you're almost pre-shadowing that for me now. So thanks for that, Chris. Sure, I know producers that bring up the whole master fader in the chorus. So the verse is actually a half a dB softer, the whole record, and then the master fader comes up to 0 on the chorus to make the chorus sound explosive. Now, if there's too many elements coming in and you don't hear the drums, then just ride the drum bus up. Another thing I would do, if I can find it quickly, is to see the multi-band compressor. I talk about this in the episode of an automation. When a lot of elements come in, where the frequencies build up is down below. Our ears are pretty well tuned to pick out a lot of parts going on in the upper mids and highs. From 1000, because that's where our voices are. You know how you're in a party and a lot of people are talking, and you can pick out a conversation even though it's noisy. That's a kind of a phenomenon of human hearing. But lower than that, 500, 300, 250, that stuff builds up really quick. And that's what makes the mix muddy and logy and gloomy and not very powerful, because it's still volume. You can only get so much volume out of your system. So you don't want that stuff to build up there. You want to get some of that out. So I use a multi-band limiter here, which you see on the screen. And that logy area would be this area right here, the low mids. And I would just rock the threshold down. You see how that's dipping out the energy when the energy exists, but when it doesn't exist, it's relaxing and letting the natural thing through. Part of my technique and the flavor of my restaurant is to do less. I'm like a natural foods guy. Don't put on a lot of sauce if you don't feel like you need a lot of sauce. And that's not to say I wouldn't go crazy sometimes and make a wild track, but in general, I find the sounds are better if you don't have to do too much to them. So a lot of times I get mixes from younger guys that have tons and tons of plugins, and I take half of them off. I try to look at them and see what they intended, and go with their idea and realize their idea maybe in a better, more elegant way with less stuff, but using the right stuff, like the right ingredients, and not overcooked and not over seasoned, but seasoned in just the right way. And that's the thing here. So you can take out those low mids, but you're not EQing them out. You're not sucking them out of the whole record, so they're going completely. They're only disappearing when there are too many of them. It's sort of like a governor on just that frequency band. Here, watch it again. Now, the reason it's working a lot right now is because we brought that bass up and we fattened that bass up. I can hear that the bass is kind of our lead guy right now, which is fine with me. I'm a bass player. But that's why that guy is working a little harder than you'll see when you get to episode 4 about mastering and automations. So yeah, 2 things. So multiband compression can help you keep everything in place and exciting, and then also automation.
Moving on.
Yes, sir. That was a good question.
That was a good question. We have Lucas. And
Lucas, what's happening?
Lucas is asking about mixing the snare.
Okay.
I always have a huge problem with getting the right sound of a snare drum and get it in the mix.
Yeah.
I really struggle with the right EQ and the mixing of the snare. Lucas apparently would like his snare to be punchier, clearer,
right.
And he would like the snare to drive the song.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that he would really appreciate your help.
It's very funny. There's on the social media right now. There's a funny meme going around, and I can't quote it exactly, but it's a cartoon with a few panels, and it goes, "While you were sleeping, I broke in your house. I stole your television." The guy's still sleeping. Yeah, whatever. "I slept with your wife. Yeah, whatever. And I changed the EQ on your snare." And the guy wakes up in a cold sweat. So you're not alone in worrying about snare EQ. And it's probably the hardest thing because, the snare can make the song, like Cameo's Word Up. Everybody knows that sound of that snare. So you want to have it crispy, which is, 2500 3K, so maybe a little bump there. But you don't want to suck out all the bottom of it either. So you need some 100, some 125 to 80, somewhere down there where the bottom part of that snare is. And you kind of don't want logy mids 400 in there. Of course, depends on the genre.
Can you show the snare here?
Yeah, let's see.
Let's see.
Let's take the room off and stuff. Okay. We have 2 top mics and a bottom mic. Now, this is a live snare, so the bottom mic is going to be the strainers, right? The snares rattling on the bottom. And the top mic is going to be the smack of the stick. More strainers. So in this case, the first thing you do is, balance the microphones how you like them. And I'm taking out, in this case, ringing frequencies. I'm sure you saw this. I hope you saw this in the episode where we found a not so great note that was ringing. That guy, we took him out, and the one below. Those are just the natural resonances on the snare. Now, if you wanted to go a little further, let's just get a EQ that we can see. So you can see from the RTA that here's the smack, like I said, 3K, something like that. So if you need a little crispness, that's where to go. You don't want to go up higher than that. That's not going to be very musical. Up there is the cymbals and other elements, the high frequency in the vocals, or if you have strings and all that, that's up a little higher. And then we see down here, around 200, we have the fundamental tone of the drum. We don't want so much of this. So those are the 2 parts of the frequency spectrum that you work with. The crisp attack part up around 2500 3K, and then the actual warmth of the drum 250, 125, whatever that particular drum is tuned to. And then if you wanted to, sorry, Gitai,
no.
I just want to say, EQ is only your first thing. That's the tone. And then the dynamic would be compression. And we also touched in the episode on envelope shaping, which would be like smack attack. Let's do that real quick. This is a really good kind of secret weapon. If you feel that the snare does not cut through and bite hard enough, just increase the attack quotient. And I also changed the sensitivity. Now, what I love about this is, as the waves going by, I have a visual representation of what the plugin is actually doing by that orange line. And they incorporated this technology into the new de-esser called Sibilance that just came out, which is really awesome because you can watch the vocal go by, and when she says an S or an F or something like that, you can see how much it's doing and just quickly adjust it. But you see how cranking up the attack helps it less, more. So those are your points of attack: the tone itself with the highs and the lows, the compression to even it out, and then maybe a transient designer. And I would also fool around with the order of that to see which one ended up with the best result. But there's a couple of things to separate like really pro engineering from people who are learning engineering, and that is the backbeat sound, right, the snare, and the vocal, where you sit the vocal in. Those are kind of the two Himalaya peaks of when you can really feel like, yeah, I kind of know what I'm doing as an engineer. And believe me, we all keep refining that. I'm sure the guys I talk to, they've mixed thousands of records, but they're always learning and they're always refining their craft in terms of vocal and backbeat, because that's what pop music is really about, isn't it?
It is. And let's move along to the cream. Martin asks, can you share some more reverb golden rules for drums? Maybe, I don't know, maybe we can
Yeah, we can experiment with that.
Yeah.
So
maybe the plates, anything from the Abbey Road that you like?
Let's put it on the whole drum. Let's treat the drum as a whole kit. So I don't know if I told the story in the episode or not, but it's a good story. I was working and the producer was going to be late. He said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to get there till 3:00. So I had the mix all set up. So I was just starting out, and there was this Lexicon 480, which has hundreds of presets and was the standard in the late 80s. So I put the snare in solo and just went through fat plate, thin plate, great big plate. Okay, that's the plate. Okay, rooms. What does a room sound like? So what is a hall? Why is a hall? Isn't a hall really in fact a room? Why is a hall different from a room? What's happening? And you can learn a lot by just soloing something like a snare or a singer and scrolling through the presets. Generally in drums, plates are the sound we normally associate with pop drums, because in the great eras of pop, 70s, 80s, 90s, that's what people had in their studios to put it through. But I had, in fact, used a plate on this mix, as you can see on the individuals, because I tend to not put too much verb on cymbals because they're washy already. But let's listen with plates. Let me turn off the parallel. So that's Abbey Road plates. Let's find it down here. That's actually an electromechanical device where there's a transducer. Whatever sound I send is going to this sort of a speaker device thing that's attached to metal, and the metal's wobbling, and then there's a microphone down at the other end, and you can control how far. The farther away the microphone is, the longer it's going to ring. That's a pretty standard operating procedure for drums. That sounds, we will rock you. A room, sometimes a plate is a little too much and too washy for me, so I would go to a room. Do I have a room verb here? I think I do, which is probably Abbey Road Chambers. And I'm going through these quickly. No, I have H verb actually here this time on the room setting. that sounds like the drums are in a booth. Now you can make that bigger or smaller. Another that can work for fast tempo stuff that you don't want to have like a ton of washy stuff on the drums. But I wouldn't necessarily use that particular room. I would fool around, and there's probably tons of presets rooms. I'll bet you. Yeah, look, drum kit room. Let's see what that's going to do. Okay, so that's got a gate on it, which we work through on some other songs. That's called nonlinear because the decay is not a straight line. It goes cut and then cuts off really fast as the gate closes. But that's an 80s kind of vibe. I've got these up really loud because I'm exaggerating them, but that tells you what the character and tone color is going to do. So that's a gated room, or just a room in general to put them in a space, especially for indie rock. That works really good. Like Emily Sande next to me has that guy in the warehouse, and he's playing the kit, and it sounds amazing. So that's a room. A hall is going to be a longer room with a lot of slapback. So that's my vocal hall. That's why it's so long. You could always have two halls, one for the voice and one for the drums. I would use hall very, very lightly on drums, on maybe something acoustic that's not super loud, because you don't want all that stuff ringing around in the background. Basically, the plate or the room or the gated room are pretty much your go-to verbs for drums. And I'm using it on the whole kit now. As I told you, I would only put it on certain elements. For example, on this rock song, I had it on, I think in the episode I went through this experimenting, and I ended up with it on the snare and the toms, but not the kick, not the hi-hat, and not the overhead. Now, you can talk to 12 engineers and there'll be 12 different opinions about that. This is my way, and I'm not here to tell you that my way is the only way. The whole point of this course is to teach you how we think, not exactly what we do. You don't have to do it my way, but you have to consider, okay, do I want a big, long, splashy verb? Do I want a short, tight reverb? And why? So, those are the things you're considering.
Very, very, very interesting. We have Bruno and also Alex, and they're both interested to know what are your thoughts on blending drum VSTs, virtual drums, with natural drums. Any specific plugin that can help them there?
Well, I would do the same treatment to the live drums before I added. I get a lot of tracks. I mean, that's a pretty good production technique nowadays, where there's maybe some loops or some sampled kicks and snares mixed with the live. The nice thing about live is that it's got the human touch. But the nice thing about samples is they're completely isolated, so they can be brought up or down without affecting other things. And they're clean and smacky because they've probably been already compressed twice before they got sampled and then resampled. So the same way we blended the bass amp with the bass direct, it would be a great idea to blend your VST drums with your live drums. And I think, I do that all the time. In fact, I really like working on that kind of music. For me, I'm not a pop consumer anymore at my age. I recognize quality when I hear it. And some of my favorite productions are tracks that have some of that element of sample beat making, and also a live guy, especially on things like fills, where a beat maker is not going to be able to play a fill the way a guy who's played drums for 20 years is going to be able to play it. So the combination platter is what I'm ordering today.
Okay, maybe we can move to a more electronic sound.
Okay.
And song. Maybe because we have a question from Andrew, and I think that maybe the song "Better World" would be best suited to experiment with.
Okay.
So he asks, some sound engineers believe that the main difference between mixing electronic and acoustic drums is the main focus of the drum kit. If you're mixing electronic drums, then you should start from the individual tracks of the kick, the snare, and build the mix around it. And if you're mixing an acoustic drum, then you should start from the room mics or the overheads and build the mix around that. What do you think about that? About it,
Okay.
and what is the main difference between mixing electronic drums or acoustic drums, in your opinion?
Okay. That's a multi-part question. Okay, let's start at the end of it. The main difference is, of course, the separation and the isolation. So when a lot of times I'm working on a live drum set record with the producer, and he'll say, "I need to hear more of the first tom," and so I'll raise the first tom, and he'll go, "Oh, the drums changed." I'm like, "Yeah, of course the drums change. It's drum kits are an instrument in and of themselves. One mic on the tom tom is going to still hear the ride cymbal, isn't it? It's still going to hear the kick drum. It's still going to hear the snare, and it's going to be slightly delayed." Some of the best drum sounds, in fact, the reason hip hop guys sample those drum sounds from the old days is they had less mics. So there was less phase cancellation, less smearing, and less just delays between all the microphones. You know, they might have a mono mic above the drummer's head and maybe a kick drum mic. Then they branched out to two, and then the Glyn Johns thing with one above, one on the side, and one in front, which he came upon by accident because there was a vocal mic that he forgot was on, and all of a sudden the drum sounded huge. So there's all these kind of stories about how drum miking came to be, and you can read about the Beatles engineers getting deeper and deeper into multiple miking until we get to the era of Steely Dan and Earth, Wind and Fire, where everything is quite mic'd. And now guys are doing the close room, the middle room, the far room. And I understand having all those options, but I also like the purity of less stuff. So the first answer to the last part of your question is the bleed is the main difference. So the overheads or the rooms, and you asked about which do you start with. I start with the overheads because I want the drums to be a little bit focused and present. But both the overhead picture and the room picture is what that kit really sounds like, right? If you just turn up the right and left overheads, and hopefully they were mic'd in the proper arrangement to the drum kit itself, that's the picture of your drum. So I listen to that carefully and maybe rebalance it if one mic is recorded hotter than the other, because there's so many parameters in the recording chain. Maybe the mic pre was set differently for the two mics. Maybe it's two different mics. Get that picture. Then I mute that. Then I get a good kick sound with the multiple kick mics I have, or maybe just one. Then I get a good snare sound. Get the kick and snare balance, almost like hip hop, but it's live drums. Get the kick and snare rocking, and then I bring that overhead picture up into it until it's, too much overheads is going to sound roomy because they're far away from the kick and snare, and then not enough overheads, it's not going to have any energy because the energy is coming from the high end of the cymbals in addition to the 1, 2, 3, 4 of the beat, right? So boom, crack, that's where the subdivision energy or the hi-hat, of course, also. So that's my way of thinking about it. Listen to the picture, mute the picture, bring up the individual kick and snare, then bring up the overheads till those four match. Now we've got all the rest of the mics, usually one hi-hat and three toms. I think of those as a group of auxiliary clarifiers, similar to recording an orchestra and having a mic close to the strings, right? I need to hear more of the viola. Okay. I need to hear more of the tom. I need to hear more of tom 3. I need to hear more of, or I want a fatter tom 3. So I'll put R bass on tom 3 and then crack that mic in. And then the room to me is the real ambience. So I don't have to manufacture ambience like we just did on the reverb sense. So now the room, maybe compress that a little bit and bring that up as the room reverb itself. Now when you have sample drums, you can do anything you want. Everything is isolated. I'm not talking about a VST drum kit. I'm talking about if somebody made a beat on Machine or an MPC or something like that. So the kick is the kick, the snare is the snare. Then you just balance it. Anything goes. Just make it musical. Make it rock. A lot of times I do what I think is best, and the producer's a drum-oriented guy, so he's like, Dave, man, we need more kick, or bring up all the drums. You can always learn from collaborating. You don't. I would never say to a producer, no, this is good, man. I like it. I'm going to go with him and see where we go. And if he goes too far, I'm going to pull him back and say, bro, I think we went a little crazy on the kick drum. Yeah, you might be right. Okay, but let's let the creative juices go. Let's let out the leash and see where we get, and we can always pull it back. So I hope that was kind of a rambling monologue there, but I hope I hit some of the high points of your question.
You sure did. We have a question from Taji. I hope I'm not butchering the name. He says that he noticed you use the L316 to soft clip the drum bus on one of the
Yes,
songs.
it's actually this song. Good timing,
Yeah.
Tajik.
And he says he asked what made you choose the L316 as
Oh.
opposed to the L1 or L2, and
Excellent question.
is it a feeling and or technical choice? If it's a technical choice, then what does the L316 offer that the other limiters do not?
It's kind of similar to the different compressors. I find that all the L series has different colors, and I don't know the inner workings, what's going on underneath the hood, but I assume it's the algorithm that they're working with. The L1 was the original one that brought the levels up. I actually had the box for a while, and would run my analog mixes through the box. Even a rough monitor mix, before I sent it home with the client, I would run it through the L1 because it just gave us that gumption, that immediacy. Now the L2 came out after that, and I felt that was warmer. Like, okay, now it's an improvement. Those were the days when some people were sniffing at digital for being a little too harsh. Okay, so the L2 is still powerful and strong, but less harsh than the L1. Although in some cases, like maybe claps or something like that, the L1 is perfect. It's just bang, it's immediate. Now the L3 has a lot of different what they call profiles, which I'm assuming is attacks and releases, or maybe algorithms. So lean and mean, loud and proud, bup bup bup. And the L3 to me is a little warmer in color. My perception of it, I might be not correct about this, but that's how I feel about it. And so I didn't want anything that changed. I like the tone of the producer's drum set itself, so I didn't want to change the tone too much. So if you remember from the episode, I spent a little bit of time balancing, and he exported everything so close. If you look at these volume numbers, between the loudest thing at 4 here and 9, I only did 2.5 dBs up or 2.5 dBs down from what he would have sent me at 0, because he worked very hard already. That's another thing about mixing. If you're mixing somebody else's stuff, so I didn't work on the creation of this. I got it after the fact. So respect. This guy's worked really hard, and who's ever involved in this production, from everyone, from who's funding it to who's going to put it out to the artist, they've all been considering it for a long time. So it's not upon me to go, well, we don't need this and we need more of that. And that's just an issue of respect for their art. And nobody knows it all. I don't care who it is. So we balance the drums. Let's turn this smack off. Let's go to where they're rocking away here. Maybe here in the drop. And then I think I changed my setting. I think it was loud and proud there. Now, as you can see, we're not even really attenuating everything, but you can hear the color change. I'm going to bypass it and unbypass it a few times. So this goes back to our snare questions earlier in the program today about how do we get them to be articulate? How do we get them to really cut through? So limiting, even though there's all these articles about the volume wars and everything, okay, don't limit it so it's distorting, but limiting is a very valuable and positive tool. I don't look at limiting as a negative. I look at it as a positive if it's not overused. It's like anything. My dad used to tell me, all things in moderation. So yeah, if I limit it to death, you hear that distortion, right? That's not what we're looking for. We're just looking for that little bit of extra punch. And you can see the attenuation meter on a very light setting like that. It's hardly working. Not even working. There. 1.6 dBs if I hit it harder than I was hitting it actually in the record. I always try to think of it as, am I altering it too much? Is it really doing what I'm asking it to do, or is it just changing it so much that I like it because now it's different? You really always try to go back to what's your rationale? Are you putting 97 plugins in just because you have 97 plugins? Are you really thinking about what they're doing? And that's what's going to make you a better engineer. Be able to back up your choices. If somebody, like you guys are calling me on the carpet, hey, Dave, why'd you do that? Well, I'd better be able to explain it. Well, I thought it would be good. That's not a reason. The reason is because it changes the character in the way that I wanted to make it pop out of the record. Boom.
Yeah.
I hope I got the answer right for you.
I'm sure you did, Dave. And unfortunately, our time is getting shorter. And we have time maybe for one last question.
Okay. Make it a good one.
All right. So this one is from Luigi. And
Luigi.
Yeah, Luigi's asking, sometimes I have to deal with audio materials that sound really bad, weird. People produce music in untreated rooms with
Me too, Luigi. I feel you, man. I know exactly where you're going.
All those phase cancellation issues, etc. And he says that when he tries to fix it with massive processing and when he's finishing it, then the music sounds better. It does sound better, but it's different from what the artist had initially given him. So his question is, where is the actual limit of a mixing engineer? Do you want to deliver something that sounds cool but risks sounding different by the initial artist idea, or get out something not so good and try not to change the sound that much?
Okay, this calls up a war story. I was mixing a record for an artist named Curtis Stigers, who was a kind of a really great live guy. And the producer was Stuart Lerman, who did the music for Boardwalk Empire and Vinyl and The Aviator. He's an esteemed, really smart producer. And so they left me at my SSL for about 4 hours. And the record was super roomy and just like live demo-y sounding. And I spent hours gating and compressing and EQing, getting all the room out. And they came back, okay, Dave, let's hear it. And I pushed play, and I knew right away that I had done the wrong thing, that their faces all fell. And like, man, what happened to the vibe we had on the rough mix? Because that's what they wanted. So the answer to your question is, there's never a point where you say, oh, you're going too far, you haven't gone far enough. What's the purpose of your mix? What are you being asked to do? I talk about this a lot in the course of A-being against other genres, other people in our genre, that what we're doing, this is a pop, hip-hop kind of vibe. So if it's cut too roomy and you don't want it to be too roomy, then work hard and get that roominess out of it and that bad source. The record is always going to have the DNA that it was cut with. But, listen to some concert footage. Listen to that new thing that's out on the Rolling Stones playing in Mexico. That's Bob Clearmountain. It sounds so live, you almost don't know it's mixed. You're like, these guys are really good. I don't see them hitting the drums that hard, but it sounds amazing. Then you read the credits at the end. It's Bob Clearmountain. Oh, he did just enough, so it really sounded live, and you just totally believed it, but it was a gorgeous mix. That's it for today.
Yeah, it seems that we're under a minute to go. And Dave, I wanted to thank you.
Thank you guys, man.
Really, you took time off your busy schedule and hung out with us. And I'm
fun,
sure,
guys. I hope you tune in next week. It was really fun. Really good questions today. Awesome.
Yeah, keep sending those questions so we can. We hope to get to most of them next time. Again, thank you, Dave. and I'm sure everybody have learned something here.
Hope so. I'll see you at episode 2, which is all about the vocals.